The great chamber stretched for miles in every direction, carved from the heart of a dead moon that the ancient races had hollowed out thousands of years before humanity ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. Ambassador Vethal stood at the central podium, his tall and slender body glowing with soft blue light that pulsed beneath his transparent skin, and he looked out at the assembled representatives of 847 spacefaring civilizations with absolute confidence. In what he was about to propose, the Galactic Concord had maintained peace and order for 12,000 years, and in all that time, they had faced many threats, but none quite like the one Vethal was about to describe. Fellow members of the Concord, he began, his voice carrying through the chamber via translation devices that converted his words into hundreds of different languages simultaneously. I come before you today to discuss a matter of grave importance to the future of our civilization. He waved one of his forearms, and a holographic display appeared above the podium, showing a small blue and green planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in a quiet corner of the galaxy. This is Earth, Vethal continued, the homeworld of a species that calls itself humanity. And I am here to tell you that if we do not act now, this single world will become the greatest threat our Concord has ever faced. Murmurs rippled through the chamber as representatives leaned forward in their seats or adjusted their sensory organs to get a better look at the display. 60 years ago, humanity discovered faster than light travel, Vethal explained, and in that short time, they've already caused more disruption than species 10 times their age. He changed the display to show a series of incidents. Human traders undercutting established trade routes. Human scientists reverse engineering technology they had no right to possess. Human diplomats refusing to bow to Concord authority. They refused to join the Concord as a subordinate member, Vethal said, his skin pulsing red with anger. They demanded equal status, equal voting rights, equal representation, as if 60 years of space travel somehow made them our equals. Laughter echoed through the chamber from several delegations, but Vethal raised his hand for silence. Do not laugh, he warned. I have studied these creatures, and I tell you now that their arrogance is matched only by their cunning. He pulled up biological data showing human adaptability, their ability to survive in extreme conditions, their rapid breeding cycles, their resistance to diseases that would kill most other species. They adapt faster than any species we have ever encountered, Vethal said. They learn faster, they breed faster, and most dangerous of all, they refuse to accept their place in the natural order of things. High Counselor Mirith, an ancient being whose crystalline body had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, leaned forward in their seat. What do you propose, Ambassador? They asked, their voice like wind chimes in a storm. Vethal turned to face the High Counselor directly. I propose cleansing, he said, and gasps filled the chamber. I propose that we send the extinction fleet to Earth and wipe humanity from existence before they become too powerful to stop. The chamber erupted into chaos as representatives shouted arguments for and against the proposal, some calling it necessary and others calling it barbaric. But Vethal simply waited for the noise to die down. I know this is extreme, he said when he could be heard again. But I have run the projections, and if we allow humanity to continue growing at their current rate, they will surpass our military capabilities within 200 years. He showed the projections on the display, lines and graphs that painted a terrifying picture of exponential growth and technological advancement. 200 years, Vethal repeated. That is nothing to species that live for millennia, and yet in that time, these humans will go from a minor nuisance to an existential threat. The debate continued for 3 days, with representatives arguing passionately on both sides, but in the end, the numbers spoke for themselves. 831 civilizations voted in favor of cleansing, 16 voted against. Earth was sentenced to death, and the extinction fleet would arrive in 90 standard days to carry out the sentence. Bethel allowed himself a small smile as the vote was announced, confident that he had just saved the galaxy from a terrible fate. But far across the galaxy, in a small office on a space station orbiting a gas giant, a woman named Sarah Chun received a priority transmission that made her blood run cold. Sarah had been embedded in the Concorde's diplomatic corps for 30 years, working her way up from a minor translator to a trusted aide in the Cyrithian delegation, and all that time, she had never broken cover. But this was different. This was extinction. She moved quickly through the station's corridors, her heart pounding in her chest, knowing that what she was about to do would mean her death, but also knowing that she had no choice. She reached a hidden communication terminal that she had installed years ago for exactly this kind of emergency, and she began typing a message to Earth using a code that only 3 people in the entire human government would recognize. They voted today. She typed, her fingers trembling. 831 to 16 in favor of cleansing. Extinction fleet launches in 3 days and will arrive at Earth in 90. I am sorry. I could not stop this. Tell my family I love them. She hesitated for a moment, then added one final line. They are coming, all of them. She hit send and watched the message disappear into the void of space, traveling faster than light toward a planet that had no idea it had just been sentenced to die. Then she stood up, walked to her quarters, and waited for the soldiers, who she knew would come for her within the hour. The Concorde had voted to destroy Earth. They thought it would be easy. They thought humanity would simply accept their fate and die quietly like so many species before them. They were wrong. 90 days, that was all the time humanity had to prepare for the greatest battle in their history, to face an enemy with thousands of years of experience and tens of thousands of warships. 90 days to find a way to survive. And somewhere in the back of Bethal's mind, in a place he would never acknowledge, a tiny voice whispered that perhaps he had made a terrible mistake. But he silenced that voice and returned to his quarters to celebrate his victory, never knowing that the death warrant he had just signed was not for humanity. It was for the Concorde itself. Director Elias Okonkwo sat alone in his office at the United Earth Defense Initiative headquarters, reading the message from Sarah Chun for the 5th time, hoping that somehow the words would change if he looked at them long enough. They did not change. 831 civilizations had voted to wipe humanity from existence, and they had 90 days before the extinction fleet arrived to carry out the sentence. Elias was 63 years old, a former soldier who had fought in 3 wars on Earth before being appointed to lead humanity's defense against threats from beyond the stars. And in all his years of service, he had never felt fear like this. But fear was a luxury he could not afford. He picked up his phone and made a call that would change everything. "Get me every world leader," he said, his voice steady despite the terror in his heart. "Every general, every admiral, every scientist with security clearance. I want them all in a secure conference within the hour." The meeting lasted 72 hours without a single break. Leaders screamed at each other. Generals pounded tables. Scientists wept as they explained just how outmatched humanity truly was. The extinction fleet numbered over 40,000 warships, each one more advanced than anything Earth could build. And humanity had only 600 vessels capable of fighting in space. "We cannot win this war," Admiral James Morrison said, his face pale and drawn. "The mathematics are simple. Even if every one of our ships destroyed 10 of theirs, we would still lose by a factor of 60. Then we changed the mathematics." Director Okonkwo replied. He stood up and walked to the front of the room, pulling up a file that had been classified so deeply that only 4 people on Earth knew it existed. "Project Prometheus," he said, 15 years ago, our best scientists developed a series of weapons and technologies that were deemed too dangerous to ever use artificial singularity. Generators that could crush entire fleets into atoms. Antimatter warheads that could crack planets in half. Ships designed to jump directly into enemy formations and detonate their cores. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. We called it theoretical suicide. Okonkwo continued, because the risks of using these technologies were almost as great as the risks of not using them. But theoretical suicide is better than certain extinction. General Yuki Tanaka, the commander of Earth's ground forces, leaned forward in her seat. "You want us to become monsters," she said quietly. "I want us to survive," Okonkwo replied. "And if that means becoming monsters, then so be it. We can worry about our souls after we have saved our species." The vote was unanimous. Project Prometheus was activated. And across the planet, dormant weapons programs roared back to life like sleeping dragons awakened from ancient slumber in Antarctica. Beneath 3 miles of ice, scientists restarted the antimatter foundries that had been shut down after an accident. Killed 2,000 people. They worked around the clock, producing enough antimatter to power 10,000 warheads, knowing that a single mistake could vaporize the entire continent on the moon. The great shipyards abandoned all safety protocols and began constructing vessels at 10 times. Their normal rate workers died in industrial accidents every day. Their bodies sent home to families who were told that their loved ones had given their lives for the survival of the species on Mars. Engineers converted mining vessels into kamikaze ships, stripping out life support systems and navigation. Computers to make room for massive antimatter cores that would turn each ship into a flying bomb and on Earth itself. General Tanaka began preparing the population for the possibility that the space battle might fail. Every city was fortified. Every building turned into a potential fortress. Every citizen trained in guerrilla warfare and given weapons to fight the alien soldiers who might one day walk their streets. "We will not surrender," Tanaka told her troops. "We will not run. If they want this planet, they will have to take it from our cold, dead hands. And even then, we will find a way to drag them down into hell with us." Meanwhile, humanity's intelligence services worked desperately to learn everything they could about their enemy. They studied Concord military doctrine, analyzing thousands of battles from the last 12,000 years. Looking for weaknesses that they could exploit. What they found gave them a glimmer of hope. The Concord had never fought a species like humanity. Their wars had always been against civilizations that followed the same rules they did. Species that surrendered when defeat was inevitable, that negotiated when the cost of fighting became too high. They do not understand total war, General Tanaka observed during one late-night strategy session. They do not understand what it means to fight until the last man, woman, and child lies dead in the rubble. Then we will teach them. Director Okonkwo replied. The 90 days passed in a blur of frantic activity, of sleepless nights and desperate improvisation, of sacrifices that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Families said goodbye to loved ones who volunteered for suicide missions, knowing they would never see them again. Parents held their children and tried to explain why daddy or mommy had to fly a ship full of explosives into an alien fleet. Scientists worked until they collapsed, then were revived with stimulants and sent back to their laboratories. 3 of humanity's greatest physicists died from heart attacks in the final week, their bodies giving out even as their minds pushed the boundaries of what was possible. And through it all, Director Okonkwo stood at the center, coordinating the greatest mobilization in human history, turning a species that had been squabbling among itself for millennia into a united force with a single purpose: survival. On the 89th day, he received a message from the outer solar system. Human scouts had detected the extinction fleet emerging from hyperspace at the edge of the system. 40,000 warships arranged in perfect formation. A wall of metal and death that stretched across the void. Okonkwo read the message, then looked out the window at the blue sky above Earth, at the clouds drifting lazily across the sun, at the world that the Concord had decided did not deserve to exist. "They are here," he said to no one in particular. Then he turned back to his desk and began issuing the orders that would begin the bloodiest battle in galactic history. Humanity was outgunned, outmatched, and outnumbered by a factor of 60 to 1. But they were ready to fight, and the Concord had no idea what they had awakened. Fleet Commander Rick Solon stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Judgment, and surveyed the human defenses with something that might have been pity if his species had been capable of such an emotion. 600 ships. That was all humanity had managed to assemble to defend their world. 600 primitive vessels armed with crude railguns and nuclear weapons that would have been considered obsolete by Concord standards 1,000 years ago, against 40,000 of the most advanced warships in the galaxy. It was not even a contest. Rick Solon had commanded fleets for 300 years, had overseen the cleansing of 17 worlds, and had never once felt anything but confidence when facing an enemy. This would be no different. "Open a channel to the human homeworld," he ordered, his mandibles clicking together in what passed for anticipation among his kind. The communication officer complied, and a moment later, Rick Solon found himself looking at a human face on the view screen, an older male with dark skin and tired eyes, who identified himself as Director Elias Okonkwo, People of Earth. Rick Solon began, his translator rendering his words into the human language. "You have been judged by the Galactic Concord and found guilty of crimes against the natural order. Your sentence is cleansing, the complete eradication of your species from existence." He paused, expecting to see fear in the human's eyes. But instead, he saw nothing but cold determination. "Stand down your defenses and surrender your world." Rick Solon continued, "And your end will be painless. Resist, and you will suffer before you die." The human was silent for a long moment, and then he spoke a single sentence that Rick Solon would remember for the rest of his very short life. "We decline." The channel went dead. Rick Solon stared at the blank screen for a moment, confused by the human's response. No species had ever declined the offer of a painless death. No species had ever chosen to fight against impossible odds rather than accept the inevitable. "Curious," he muttered, then turned to his tactical officer. "Begin the assault standard formation." Overwhelming force. The extinction fleet began to move. 40,000 warships advancing toward the tiny blue planet in perfect synchronization. And Rick Solon settled back in his command chair to watch the slaughter. The first wave consisted of 200 vessels, more than enough to sweep aside the human defenses and establish orbital superiority. They moved past the outer planets, past the gas giants and asteroid belts, heading directly toward Earth, and then they vanished. Rick Solon sat up in his chair, his multifaceted eyes scanning the tactical display for any sign of his ships. But there was nothing, no debris, no energy signatures, no distress signals. 200 warships had simply ceased to exist. What happened? He demanded, but his officers had no answer. Hidden among the asteroids of the outer system, humanity's first surprise was waiting artificial singularity generators, machines that could create tiny black holes powerful enough to crush anything within range into atoms. The technology was unstable and dangerous, requiring so much power that 3 of Earth's continental grids had burned out during testing. But it worked, and the Concord had no defense against weapons that bent the very fabric of space and time. Rick Solon ordered his fleet to scatter and regroup, abandoning the standard formation that had served the Concord for 12,000 years in favor of a more cautious approach. It did not help the human. Ships launched their attack while the Concorde fleet was still in disarray. And what happened next defied everything Rick Solon thought he knew about warfare. Human vessels jumped directly into the middle of his formations. Their hyperdrives overloaded and their antimatter cores set to critical. And when they arrived, they did not fight. They exploded. Each ship took out dozens of Concorde vessels. The antimatter detonations, creating spheres of pure annihilation that vaporized everything they touched. Rick Solon watched in horror as a single human ship, no larger than a shuttle, appeared in the middle of his flagship's escort formation and detonated with enough force to destroy 15 warships in an instant. "They are attacking themselves," his tactical officer said, his voice trembling with something that Rick Solon had never heard before: fear. The Concorde had no word for kamikaze, no concept of soldiers who would willingly die to kill their enemies, no understanding of a species that considered death an acceptable price for victory. By the end of the first hour, the extinction fleet had lost 1,000 ships. By the end of the first day, that number had risen to 6,000, and still the humans kept coming. Their ships were crude, and their weapons were primitive. But they fought with a ferocity that Rick Solon had never witnessed. They did not retreat when outgunned, did not surrender when surrounded, did not stop fighting until their ships were torn apart around them. One human vessel, its hull breached and its engines failing, rammed directly into a Concorde destroyer at full speed, both ships vanishing in a ball of fire that lit up the void. Another ship, disabled and drifting, detonated its reactor core as Concorde soldiers attempted to board, killing everyone aboard both vessels. A squadron of fighters, their ammunition exhausted, flew directly into the exhaust ports of a Concorde carrier, their tiny ships causing enough damage to trigger a chain reaction that destroyed the massive vessel from within. Rick Solon had never seen anything like it. The Concorde fought wars with precision and discipline, with carefully calculated force ratios and strategic withdrawals. They did not understand enemies who refused to calculate, who did not care about force ratios, who would rather die than retreat by the time the sun rose on Earth's eastern hemisphere. The extinction fleet had lost 6,000 ships and failed to land a single soldier on the planet's surface. Rick Solon stared at the tactical display, at the wreckage of his fleet scattered across the solar system, and felt something he had not felt in 300 years of command doubt. He had come to destroy a primitive species that should have died quietly and gratefully. Instead, he had found something terrible, something that fought without fear and died without regret, something that looked at extinction and refused to accept it. For the first time in his long career, Fleet Commander Rick Solon began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. The war had begun, and it would not end until one side was completely destroyed. The only question was which side that would be. The battle for Earth lasted 11 months, and every single day of those 11 months was a nightmare that the galaxy would never forget. The Concorde called for reinforcements after the first week, sending urgent messages to every member world demanding more ships, more soldiers, more weapons to crush the impossible human resistance. And the reinforcements came, thousands of vessels pouring into the Sol system from across the galaxy. But it did not matter. For every ship the Concorde sent, humanity found a way to destroy it. And the methods they used grew more creative and more terrifying with each passing day. They filled asteroids with explosives and launched them at Concorde formations. They hacked into Concorde communication systems and spread false intelligence. They captured enemy soldiers and learned their weaknesses through interrogation methods that the Concorde considered barbaric. And when the Concorde finally managed to land troops on Earth's surface, they discovered that the space battle had been the easy part. General Yuki Tanaka commanded the ground defense, and she had spent the entire 90 days of preparation turning the planet into a death trap. Every city was a fortress. every building a potential ambush site, every street corner hiding explosives or snipers or both. The Concord soldiers had never faced urban warfare against a civilian population that refused to surrender in Tokyo. Tanaka led the defense personally for 4 months. The Concord threw everything they had at the city. Wave after wave of soldiers supported by armored vehicles and airstrikes, but Tanaka's forces held firm. They fought from the sewers and rooftops, from basement bunkers and collapsed buildings, refusing to give ground even when they were surrounded. And outnumbered when the Concord finally captured a district, they would find it empty of living defenders, but filled with booby-traps buildings rigged to collapse, water supplies poisoned, ammunition caches wired to explode when touched. The cost in Concord lives was staggering. After 4 months, the aliens simply stopped trying to take Tokyo. They had lost too many soldiers to a single city. And there were dozens of cities still fighting across the planet. The same story played out on every continent. In New York, civilians armed with weapons salvaged from destroyed Concord vehicles fought running battles through the streets. Children as young as 12 served as scouts and messengers, memorizing patrol routes and weak points in alien armor. In Moscow, the defenders retreated into the underground metro system and waged a guerrilla war that lasted 3 months. The Concord poured soldiers into the tunnels and never saw them again. In São Paulo, a group of factory workers converted their plant into a weapons facility and armed an entire district with improvised explosives and railguns. When the Concord finally broke through their defenses, the workers detonated the factory's power core and took 5,000 alien soldiers with them. The Concord had never seen anything like it. They had conquered hundreds of worlds over 12,000 years. And every single species had eventually surrendered when the cost of fighting became too high. But humanity did not calculate costs, did not weigh lives against strategic objectives, did not stop fighting even when victory was mathematically impossible. They are insane. One Concord general reported to his superiors, "They do not value their own lives. They throw themselves against all lines knowing they will die, and they seem almost happy to do so." But humanity was paying a terrible price for its defiance. Earth's population fell from 9 billion to 4 over the course of the war. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Entire regions rendered uninhabitable by nuclear and antimatter weapons. Mars was cracked open by a Concord dreadnought's main cannon, its atmosphere venting into space and its colonies dying in minutes. The moon became a graveyard of shattered ships and dead soldiers from both sides by the 8th month. Director Okonkwo had lost everyone he loved: his wife, his children, his grandchildren, all killed in attacks on the cities where they had taken shelter. He carried their photographs in his pocket and looked at them every night before he slept, reminding himself why he was fighting, why he could not give up even when everything seemed lost. And then something unexpected happened. The 16 species who had voted against humanity's destruction began to reach out through secret channels. They sent messages of support and intelligence about Concord troop movements, risking their own safety to help the humans survive. "How are you doing this?" One message asked, "How do you keep fighting when you have already lost so much?" Okonkwo's response was simple: "We fight because we have no choice. We fight because surrender means death. We fight because this is our home, and no one takes our home from us." That message spread across the galaxy like wildfire, passed from species to species through hidden communication networks, inspiring those who had lived under Concord rule for thousands of years. If the humans can fight, they whispered to each other, maybe we can too. Human soldiers captured enemy weapons and shared the designs with allied species. Human tacticians developed strategies for defeating Concord forces and distributed them to anyone who would. Listen, human engineers found weaknesses in Concord technology and broadcast. Their findings across every frequency they could access. The seeds of rebellion were being planted. And the Concord did not even notice. They were too focused on the impossible war they were losing, on the primitive species that refused to die, on the mounting casualties that were beginning to cause unrest among their own populations. By the 11th month, Fleet Commander Rick Solon had lost 30,000 ships and 14 billion soldiers. His fleet was broken, his army was demoralized, and his government was beginning to question whether the cleansing was worth the cost. And on Earth, despite everything they had lost, the humans were still fighting, still refusing to surrender, still looking at extinction and spitting in its face. The Concord had come to destroy a primitive species that should have taken 90 days to eradicate. 11 months later, they were beginning to realize that they had awakened something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. Something that would not stop until one side or the other was completely annihilated. And somewhere in the darkness of space, the species who had been watching and waiting began to prepare for what was coming next. 1 year after the vote that was supposed to end humanity, Fleet Commander Rick Solon stood before the council chamber on Axis, primed for what he knew would be the last time. His once proud uniform was torn and stained, his body scarred from wounds that had never fully healed, his eyes haunted by memories of battles that had broken something deep inside him. He was the last surviving flag officer of the Extinction Fleet. Every other commander had died in the war against humanity, killed by kamikaze ships, or captured and executed by human forces, or simply lost in the chaos of a conflict that had spiraled far beyond anything the Concord had ever experienced. Report. Commander, High Counselor Mirith ordered, their crystalline body pulsing with barely contained anxiety. Rick Solon took a deep breath and spoke the words that no Concord officer had ever spoken before. "We have failed," he said, his voice hollow and broken. "Earth still stands. We have lost over 30,000 ships and 14 billion soldiers. And the fleet is destroyed beyond any hope of recovery." Silence fell over the chamber. 847 species staring at the broken commander in stunned disbelief. "Impossible," Ambassador Vethel sputtered, his bioluminescent skin flickering with confusion. "They were primitives. They had 60 years of space travel. How could they possibly have defeated us?" "They did not fight like any species we have ever encountered," Rick Solon replied. "They did not follow our rules, did not respect our traditions, did not surrender when they should have. They fought like animals, like demons, like nothing I have ever seen in 300 years of command." He looked directly at Vethal, and for the first time, anger flickered in his dead eyes. "You told us they would be easy," he said. "You told us they would accept their fate. You were wrong, Ambassador. And billions have died because of your mistake." Before Vethal could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the chamber. Emergency lights flashed red and blue, and panicked voices flooded the communication channels. "What is happening?" Mirath demanded. The answer came from a dozen different sources at once, each one more terrifying than the last across Concord space. Rebellions were erupting simultaneously. The Velthari colonies had declared independence and seized control of their sector's defense platforms. The Kurvani were fighting to retake their homeworld from the Concord garrison that had occupied it for centuries. A dozen other species were rising up against their masters, armed with human weapons and human tactics and human fury. The seeds that humanity had planted during the war were blooming into a revolution that would shake the galaxy to its core. "They taught them," Rick Solon whispered, understanding finally dawning. "While we were fighting them, they were teaching everyone else how to fight us." And then the final alarm sounded. The one that meant an enemy fleet had been detected at the edge of the system. Axis Prime's defenders scrambled to their stations, but they were too slow, too confused, too exhausted from a war that had drained the Concord of its strength. The ships that emerged from hyperspace were not beautiful or elegant like Concord vessels. They were ugly and scarred, held together with salvage and improvised repairs. Their hulls scorched by countless battles. They were human ships, and they were not alone. Behind them came the vessels of the 16 species who had voted against humanity's destruction. And behind them came 20 more species who had joined the rebellion, and behind them came 30 more. A fleet that grew larger with every passing moment. Director Elias Okonkwo stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Defiant Hope, and watched as his coalition assembled around him. He was old now, older than he had ever expected to live. His body worn down by a year of constant war, and his heart heavy with the weight of everyone he had lost, but his eyes were clear and his voice was strong when he opened a channel to the council chamber. "Counselors of the Galactic Concord," he said, his words reaching every corner of the great hall. "1 year ago, you voted to destroy my world. You thought we would be easy, thought we would accept our fate and die quietly like so many species before us." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You were wrong." Ambassador Vethal's skin had gone completely dark, all bioluminescence fading as terror overwhelmed his ability to regulate his own biology. "What are you?" he whispered. Okonkwo smiled, a cold smile, a tired smile, but a victorious smile nonetheless. "We are humanity," he replied. "We are the species that looks extinction in the eye and refuses to blink. You could have left us alone, could have let us grow in peace. But instead you came for our home, came for our children, came to wipe us from existence." His voice hardened, carrying the weight of 9 billion lives lost and a world nearly destroyed. "Now we are here to discuss the terms of your unconditional surrender. You have 1 hour to comply, and if you do not, we will do to your worlds what you tried to do to ours." The channel closed, and the council chamber erupted into chaos. Some representatives called for negotiation, some called for continued resistance, and some simply fled toward their ships in a desperate attempt to escape what was coming. But High Counselor Mirith, ancient and wise, understood what the others did not. The Concord was finished. They had voted to destroy Earth and signed their own death warrant. They had awakened something they could not control, could not defeat, could not even comprehend within a decade. The Galactic Concord would dissolve, replaced by a new coalition built on mutual respect and shared defense rather than domination and fear. And at the center of that coalition would be humanity, leading not because they demanded it, but because the galaxy had seen what they would sacrifice to protect what they loved. The war was over. Humanity had won, and in the halls of history, this day would be remembered as the moment when the galaxy learned a lesson it would never forget. Never corner a human, never threaten their home, and never, ever assume they will surrender. Earth had been sentenced to death by 831 civilizations who thought they knew what humanity was capable of. They were wrong, and the galaxy would never make that mistake again.